When Pastor Jung asked me to speak to Rise on the resurrection of Jesus, I said to him, don't you think we need to pick a more interesting topic? I don't normally talk to high school students. I talk to university students. And if I give a lecture on the resurrection of Jesus, how do I know they're going to understand it, or they won't just be bored with it? And he said, Bill, you don't understand how smart our high school students are here in Berkeley and at Davis. And so he assured me, give a talk on the resurrection of Jesus, and they will understand it and benefit from it. And so that's what I want to talk to you about tonight, is how do we know that Jesus is risen from the dead? Now, it seems to me that there are two ways to a knowledge of Jesus' resurrection. One is the existential or the experiential way. The other way is the historical way. The experiential way means that you know Jesus is risen from the dead because you've had a personal encounter or experience of the risen Lord yourself. The Easter hymn writer says, you ask me how I know he lives within my heart. And I think that this personal, existential approach to a knowledge of the resurrection is perfectly valid and legitimate. In fact, the vast majority of Christians in the world and down through history have known that Christ is risen primarily through this experiential way. They have neither had the training, nor the library resources, nor the leisure time to conduct a historical investigation of the resurrection of Christ. Rather, they have known that Christ is alive because they've experienced him as a living reality in their lives. And I think that's perfectly legitimate. On the other hand, it's also possible to explore the fact of Jesus' resurrection historically, using the ordinary tools of historical research, such as historians use when investigating other claims in ancient Greco-Roman history. And when you explore the Gospels with respect to the resurrection of Jesus, using the ordinary tools of historical research, then I think a very powerful case can be made for the fact of Jesus' resurrection. Now, I've got a PowerPoint here tonight that I want to use to walk through some of these points with you, not in a formal lecture way, but just in a conversational way. So, in developing a historical case for Jesus' resurrection, there are two fundamental steps that need to be engaged in. The first of these is to establish what is the data to be explained. And here I want to argue that there are four historical facts which must be explained by any adequate historical hypothesis. What are those four facts? First, Jesus' burial in the tomb. Secondly, the discovery of Jesus' empty tomb. Thirdly, his post-mortem appearances. And fourthly, the very origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. Those are the four fundamental facts that need to be explained. The second step then in developing a case for the resurrection will be to ask, what is the best explanation of these facts? And here I'm going to argue that the best explanation of the facts is that God raised Jesus from the dead. Now, the skit tonight focused primarily on that second step. What's the best explanation of these facts? But the skit just assumed that the Gospels are reliable in saying that Jesus was buried in a tomb, or that that tomb was found empty, or that his disciples saw appearances of Jesus alive after his death. How do we know that the Gospels are accurate in saying those things? That's what this first step aims to establish. So first I want to talk about that first fact, that after his crucifixion, Jesus was in fact buried by a man named Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. And among the various reasons that historians give for accepting the reliability of the burial narrative of Jesus in the Gospels are two fundamental points. Number one, Jesus' burial is multiply attested in early independent sources. This is one of the most important criteria that historians use for establishing historical events. If an event is reported in early independent sources, then this event is much less likely to have been made up, but rather must be historical, because two independent early sources wouldn't simultaneously make up the same event. And in fact, the burial narrative of Jesus is attested in about 5 different sources, such as the Gospel of Mark, the source behind the Gospel of Matthew, which is independent of Mark, the source behind the Gospel of Luke, which is independent of the other two, the Gospel of John, which is independent of the other 3 Gospels, the sermons in the book of Acts, which are also independent of the Gospels, and then finally Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, where in chapter 15 he talks about the burial of Jesus. Now, historians think that they've hit historical pay dirt when you have 2 independent early accounts of an event. In this case, we have at least 5 independent early sources that Jesus was buried by a man named Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. The second point is that as a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin that condemned Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea is unlikely to be a Christian invention. According to all of the sources we have, Jesus was placed in the tomb by a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, the high court that had condemned Jesus to the cross for blasphemy. And there was an understandable hostility in the early church toward the members of the Sanhedrin. After all, they had engineered what amounted to a judicial murder of Jesus in a kangaroo court that sent him to the Romans to be executed for treason. So there was a great deal of hostility toward the members of the Sanhedrin in the early church. And therefore, it's almost inexplicable why Christian legend would invent a Jewish member of the Sanhedrin, give him a name, and say that he was the one responsible for honoring and taking care of the burial of Jesus in a proper way by placing him in a tomb. Any later legendary account would have made the disciples bury Jesus properly, or Jesus' family members take care of his corpse. But the fact that it is a member of the Sanhedrin, a despised person who condemned Jesus to the cross, who cares for the body of Jesus and gives him an honorable burial, is best explained by the fact that this is what really happened. And therefore, the wide majority of historical scholars today regard the burial of Jesus of Nazareth in the tomb by Joseph of Arimathea as a historical fact. Fact number 2, on the Sunday morning after his crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was in fact found empty by a group of his women followers. There are a number of reasons that have led most historians to believe that the tomb of Jesus was in fact found empty. Number 1, the historical reliability of the burial story supports the historicity of the empty tomb. Now you might say to me, well, how does the reliability of the burial story show that the tomb was empty? Well, very simply in the following way. If the site of Jesus' grave were known in Jerusalem to both Jew and Christian alike, then it is impossible that a movement founded upon the resurrection of the dead man could have originated and flourished in Jerusalem in the face of an occupied tomb. If the corpse of Jesus still lay in Joseph's tomb, then the disciples could never have believed that Jesus was risen from the dead. They couldn't have convinced anybody else that he was risen. And the Jewish Sanhedrin could have put an end to the whole affair by simply pointing to the occupied tomb of Jesus, and as necessary, even go to the extreme measure of exhuming the body for all to see that he hadn't risen from the dead. And thus, if the burial narrative of Jesus is reliable, then it's a very short inference that the empty tomb story is reliable as well. And as we've already seen, the wide majority of historians do accept the historicity of Jesus' burial by Joseph in a tomb, which therefore implies that that tomb must have been empty by the time the disciples began to proclaim that Jesus was risen from the dead. Number 2, the empty tomb story is also independently attested in multiple independent early sources. The empty tomb story is also mentioned in Mark's Gospel, in the source behind Matthew and the source behind Luke, in the Gospel of John, in the sermons in the Acts of the Apostles, and it's implied in Paul's first letter to the Corinthian church in chapter 15. So that again, we have a broad range of independent sources that are early, some of the earliest materials in the New Testament, that attest to the fact of Jesus' empty tomb. Thirdly, the tomb was discovered empty by women. Now, in order to understand this point, you've got to appreciate the attitude toward women in first century Jewish society. First of all, women were not regarded as credible witnesses. According to the first century Jewish historian Josephus, the testimony of women should not even be admitted into a court of law because women were regarded as so unreliable that their testimony couldn't even be admitted into a Jewish court. Moreover, women occupied a low rung on the Jewish social ladder. For example, some early rabbinic sayings are the following: "Blessed is he whose children are male, but woe to him whose children are female." Or another rabbinical saying, every Jewish man would recite the daily prayer, "Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has not created me, a Gentile, a slave, or a woman." Similarly, another rabbinic saying said, "Sooner let the words of the law be burnt than delivered to women." So, quite honestly, women were second-class citizens in Jewish Palestinian society. Now, in light of this fact, how remarkable it is that it is women who are the discoverers of and the principal witnesses to Jesus' empty tomb. Any later legendary account would certainly have made male disciples discover the empty tomb. Peter and John say. But the fact that it is women whose testimony was regarded as worthless at that time, who are the principal witnesses to the empty tomb, is best explained by the fact that, like it or not, they were the discoverers of the empty tomb, and the gospel writers faithfully record what for them was a rather awkward and embarrassing fact. Number 4, the story is simple and lacks signs of legendary development. The story, as it's found in the Gospel of Mark, our earliest gospel, is incredibly simple and unadorned by theological or apologetical motifs that would characterize a later legendary or fictional account. There's no word of prophecy that is quoted, that is fulfilled. No Old Testament scriptures mentioned. The resurrection of Jesus is not actually described. The tomb is already empty by the time the women get there. There's no reflection on Jesus being the conqueror of death or the destroyer of hell. There's no great titles for Jesus mentioned in the empty tomb narrative. The narrative is extremely simple and reserved, describing the women who come to the tomb and find it empty. Now, to get an appreciation for how simple Mark's story is, all you have to do is compare it to the stories of the discovery of the empty tomb that are found in the apocryphal Gospels. Now, what are the apocryphal Gospels? These were forged Gospels from the 2nd century after Christ. And these do contain all sorts of legendary embellishments and theological reflections. So, for example, in the so-called Gospel of Peter, which comes from about AD 150 to AD 200, about 100 more years after Jesus' death. The empty tomb is described in the following way. The tomb is surrounded by a Roman guard, by the Jewish leadership, and by a large crowd from the surrounding countryside who have all come to watch the tomb. Suddenly, in the night, a voice rings out from heaven, and the stone over the door of the tomb rolls back by itself. Then 2 men are seen descending out of heaven and going into the tomb. Then 3 men are seen coming out of the tomb, 2 of them supporting the 3rd man. The heads of the 2 men stretch up to the clouds, but the head of the 3rd man overpasses